So this morning, at least for half of the morning, we're going to be focused on governance. And I think you all appreciate more than most other business leaders of organisations how important governance is, because employer-owned businesses really rely on good governance, good engagement and good leadership. And of course, governance is the essence of how do we bring that having a say to life in an employee-owned business. So having a stake and having a say are those two important essentials in what makes an employee-owned business work. So today we're going to be focusing on that topic, and in particular, specifically looking at the role of the trust and the trustees and exactly the role of an independent trustee. The reason that's really relevant for us at the moment is you will have seen us recently launch a new service. In fact, 3 services, and they haven't come out of the blue. They came about because of a survey that we did with you, our members, where we asked you what did you want, and you told us that you wanted services to help you identify independent trustees. So we've launched 3 options, and I'm absolutely delighted that our 3 speakers this morning are linked to the service providers behind those options. So you'll know there's an option where you can log on to the EO hub now, that you can search for independent trustees, and I'm delighted that Sue Lawrence is going to be joining us this morning, and Sue has helped provide the documentation behind that EOA independent trustee search facility. There's also an EOA independent trustee appointment service, which Gadd Associates, in association with the Russum Group, have launched, which is a facility to look at permanent trustees, independent trustees for your employer-owned business. And our 3rd service that we launched is an EOA independent trustee placement service, which is a flexible approach to how you can place independent trustees, which has been launched by the Eternal Business Consultancy and Boardroom Advisors, and Campbell MacDonald is joining us this morning as one of our speakers. So we know governance is really important. The role of the independent trustee is an essential part of that. And why is that essential? We're going to find out. So I'm delighted we've got 3 speakers this morning, so I'm going to introduce them now. I asked each of them to tell me a secret about themselves. So I think what I might do is I might tell you the 3 secrets at the end, and you can guess which one has which secret. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Sue Lawrence. Sue is the founder of Independent Directors and Trustees, which is a collective of trustees and non-executive directors who share their knowledge for mutual benefit. She's also an author of books on the governance of trusts and for the Chartered Governance Institute. She's also a trained chartered director and an independent trustee for a wide variety of companies of different sizes and different sectors. Our second guest this morning is Jeremy Gadd. Jeremy is the founder and MD of Gadd Associates. They support organisations to transition into and or lever the benefits of employee ownership. He's also an author. He authored the Employee Ownership Manual along with Robert Postlethwaite, where Jeremy commented and wrote on the people side of moving to employee ownership. He's also an academic because he studied the impact on leaders of when organisations become employee-owned, and as you would expect, he's also an independent trustee, this time of both Aardman Animations and the Rooflight Company. And Campbell MacDonald is our 3rd guest this morning. Campbell has worked in the employer-owned sector for over 14 years, supporting dozens of organisations with transition and ownership culture. And some of you will know he was also the previous managing director of Baxendale. Campbell is currently the part-time chief executive of the EOA's research partner and independent think tank Ownership at Work, and he also is an independent chair of the trustees at global architecture firm Broadway Mallion. So one of these people is an ex-YTS, some of you will remember, youth training scheme candidate, who's also very good with a chainsaw. One of them is fascinated by Caterham Sevens, which are those little sports cars that you might see racing around tracks at a weekend. And one of them accidentally asked out Jane Horrocks, the actress. I'll let you guess which one is which, and maybe we'll reveal that at the end. So I would like to welcome all three of our speakers now. If you can all unmute if you haven't already. I'm just trying to see if I can see you all. It's quite difficult on this screen. Where are you all? Where are they? Yes, I think I can see you all. Can you give me a wave? This is really awkward. I can't. There you are. You're all together on my screen. That's good. So I hope I did justice to each of the three of you there. We've got now about 35 minutes to have a conversation about governance. Obviously, this has been highlighted as a conversation about the independent trustee, but I want to kick off straight away by asking, what do we mean by governance? So Sue, can I go to you first? And then Jeremy, Campbell, do you want to add in anything that you think Sue might have missed? So what's governance, Sue?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Thanks for the introduction, and hi, everybody. For me, just answering that question, governance is like the skeleton of your business. It's a thing you shouldn't see, but it should hold everything together. And if it goes wrong, the business will probably fall over. From an EO perspective, I see it as that you've got those three elements. You've got the operating board, you've got the trustees, and then you've got the employee voice, the employee council, whatever that looks like. It's the roles and responsibilities of those three forums together, but it's also their interaction, and it's what they drive and what they deliver, and equally what they don't deliver. So I think it's those three elements and bringing those all together so you get that robust sort of framework, that skeleton that keeps everything working together.
Thanks, Sue. Jeremy, have you got anything to add to that? That was a fairly comprehensive description.
It was. I think for me, I look at it from the operational governance, so the active element of that. And I think it's about providing oversight for the organisation. And as Sue mentioned, you've got those three component parts within an employee-owned business. Somebody once described to me, it's like rate. It's responsive. It checks that the organisation is responsive. It's accountable, transparent, and empowering. Okay,
Campbell, do you want to add anything else? Sorry to come to you last, because the other two might have stolen all your thunder.
No problem. The only thing I think I'd add is the human dimension. I just think it's particularly critical in an employee-owned firm. And particularly right now, if I look at the way that organizations struggling in the last 12 months have leaned back on the governance within the organization, and that has then driven the response to looking after people, and that how critical that is then to resilience and to sustainability. I think that, it can seem quite dry if you're not in it, and that kind of very human outcome is important to hold in mind.
Right, okay. So governance is a skeleton, it provides oversight, and it's about humanity. Interestingly, the Chartered Governance Institute's definition is corporate governance is the system of rules, practices and processes by which a company is directed and controlled. Quite a harsh, hard description. I think we've just provided a much more complete description.
I think I prefer Campbell's description myself, but I understand their need to have something very clear.
Yes, yeah. Okay, let's dive in then. So independent trustees, I want to kick off by asking the question, why have an independent trustee? So Campbell, can I go to you first? Why do you think it's important to have an independent trustee? What are they actually bringing?
I think that an independent trustee brings a set of things. I won't cover them all because you want to go hear from two other people, but for me, the critical element here is timing. I think that's why we asked the question about where people are on their journey towards employee ownership. I think there are some core elements around safe pair of hands, external insight, expertise, etc. But just on those phases, if you're brand new, your independent trustee is really helping you lay the foundations for how employee ownership is going to work in the business, and that's obviously critical. As you're getting used to it, and your year one, your year two, your independent trustee is, as much as anything else, coaching, really supporting, particularly I think the employees who may be trustees, to get their head around what the role is and what's asked. And then for a more mature firm, I think coming in with some challenge, some fresh insight from from what else is going on around the sector, driving some refreshed thinking. So I think depending on the stage you're at, there's a sort of USP, if you like, that the independent trustee brings into the mix.
Okay, Jeremy.
Yeah,
so what's your view of what we've heard about the timing and the relevance dependent on the stage you're at, but what's the other benefit of having that independent voice?
Well, I think partly the clue's in the name. They are independent, and I think that's incredibly helpful, particularly for any organisation to bring in an external view. It's not unusual for organisations, particularly when they've gone through an employee transition and the transaction, to be very internally focused. And bringing some external experience to the trust board is incredibly powerful. And I would echo and support what Campbell said so far.
So, you got anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think they've covered off quite a lot of the points there. I think the other thing that the trustee can do is they can be that interface to the operating board as well, that potentially the employee trustees or the management trustees can't do, so that they can sort of really engage with the board in a slightly different way to the employees might be able to do. And because they are independent, as Jeremy said, you're neutral, but you can also bring experience from other organisations, other EO organisations, other businesses you might have worked with. It just brings a fresh perspective.
So if we turn it on its head then, so we've heard some really positive things about why an independent trustee is helpful and when they might be useful to the organisation. What are the risks of not having an independent voice? Because I guess there's some organisations who are sat wondering, maybe lots of SMEs don't tend to have external voice, not already on the board. So some leaders and founders might be a bit sceptical about really what can they bring that I don't already have. So what's the risk of not having an independent voice?
Deb, can I answer that in a way of going back to your previous question, which I think part of the advantage of having an independent trustee is they can bring a level of experience or expertise in a part that the trust doesn't have or the organisation doesn't have. So therefore the risk of not having an independent trustee is you're possibly limiting your access to that kind of experience, which in an oversight way can be incredibly useful because they're able to ask, as Campbell said, challenge sometimes can be quite scary for people, but able to challenge and ask the questions to help broaden the thinking and the strategy development of the organisation. So by not having there, I think there's an inherent risk in that. But also, I think what a trustee brings is it can help you. Getting the independent trustee is really useful in making quite sure you get the right type. So maybe they've got experience in chairing, or they've got particular financial experience, or legal experience, or employee engagement experience. Okay. So they're adding something to that mix.
Yeah, we'll come back to the sort of skills we're looking for in a second. So that's really interesting. So the challenge that they provide is something that it's a risk if you don't have that. So thoughts on what are the risks if you don't have you got examples of where you've seen organisations that haven't had an independent trustee? Have you seen any examples where things have gone a bit awry?
Yeah, well, let me give an example maybe of where it was beneficial to have an independent trustee. If you remember what the role of the trust is, it's threefold, everything's in threes. It's the oversight of the health of the current business, it's the challenge to the future the operating board and the future direction of the business, and it's ensuring that the operating board is effective in delivering against those two. I mean, I've worked on a board before, a trustee board before, where the only other trustees were employees, and that challenging the effectiveness of the board and looking at strategy. They'd never looked at strategy before, so what does that mean? It was very uncomfortable for them to sort of talk to the directors and challenge them as to whether they're being effective or not. And I see challenge as a positive. It's not aggressive, it's not negative. It should be consultative, and it gives you that consultative way of doing it. But also the independent can have that conversation, whereas an employee trustee can't. And a sort of an independent trustee can have a collegiate way of talking with the operating board and with the other directors, because they're normally used to acting in that role as well.
Campbell, in your role as the independent chair of the trustees at Broadway and Malyon, so can you sort of relate to what Sue and Jeremy have just been talking about in terms of what you're bringing to that role?
Yes, you know, I think that it's 100% right to say that there are conversations that the independent trustee can front up, if you like, with the business, which is much harder to do, particularly if you're an employee trustee rather than a management trustee, let's say. But to your risk point, and again, I'm going to go back to timing. You know, yeah, I've seen it go wrong, and you know, and I've you know, too many times been brought in to fix a mess because actually, perhaps, you know, an announcement has been made early on as a part of transition, expectations set with employees about what the move to employee ownership means, and if people's expectations aren't managed, then what you find is that there's a lot of different ideas about what's going to be different, what's going to change on day one. And then when some of that change doesn't happen immediately, people can be frustrated, and somehow you've turned a positive into a negative, and you know, people are annoyed by that. And some of what the independent trustee does is bring in a little bit of calmness, bring in a little element of recognition that the kind of change that employees quite often expect can take time, but also that they may simply have misunderstood what the transition actually means for them, and how much voice and how much influence, and whether suddenly everything they asked for is going to instantly be done. And the independent trustee is a much more useful feature or character to be able to push back on employee expectations and reset them at a realistic level than management, because that debate between management inevitably becomes quite heated quite quickly. We were promised this, we're not getting this, you're not telling us this, and that independent becomes just an enormously useful person to be sat in the middle of that. Deb, there's a question in the chat, and I don't know whether you want us to pick those up. Will you direct those at us?
I was going to say, first of all, I was going to remind people to put their questions in the chat, and I noticed the first one's just come in from, I hope you don't mind me saying it, from, I think it's a he, Chris Sellers. Doesn't the nature of employee ownership create more conflicts of interest in which an independent voice is useful and needed? Which I guess is actually what you're starting to pick up, yeah. Campbell. And it's interesting, you made the point right at the outset, Campbell, that you made the distinction between the stage of employee ownership and the role of the independent trustee. And I guess I want to move us on to that now. I think you've given a really good account of why an independent trustee is very valuable to an organisation. If you think about the type of person that you want as an independent trustee, can we talk a little bit more about that now, in terms of how does their role differ from the employee trustee and the management trustee, if there are those, and what are you looking for particular skills then? So if you're sat here now in this meeting as an EO business thinking about an independent trustee, are you trying to create a job description yourself? Are you trying to look at sort of competencies? What are you looking for? Sue, can I maybe start with you, just because you're looking straight at me on the screen?
I'll start looking away. I think it's a good question, and I'm going to pick up on one of the chat ones in the future as well about the timing. But the independent trustee, I met somebody once who said, oh, we're deliberately looking for somebody who's got a different character and personality for our business. We're creatives. We don't want another creative, because that's the way our conversations go all the time anyway. We want somebody that brings a different dynamic. And I think when we've spoken to people before, there's often this misunderstanding of the independent trustee role as being almost a NED, and there's a question around, should you have sector experience? What's your network like in our sector, and can you do this and can you do that? And I think there's this confusion around the independent director isn't there as an NED for the operating board. They're not there to grow your business. If you need a salesperson, go and recruit a salesperson. Don't expect your independent trustee to do that. And also it's that personality fit, but understanding that you want a bit of challenge, so you do need it to be different. Otherwise, the real value of having an independent trustee is they change the nature of the conversation. They bring different questions in. And if you recruit somebody that you know already, I know some companies have, they call them an independent trustee, maybe they're a previous employee, or they're a friend of the founder, or they're somebody very connected to the business. Well, they're not bringing a different dimension in. They're not bringing a different direction of travel or conversation. So think about your current culture of your business, your ethos of the business and what you do, and actually then think about something different. If you're a business that's very static in the way you look at, you're not sort of, you look at things in a very process driven ways, have a think about whether you want somebody who's not process driven, just because they will ask questions and they'll think of things and look at things slightly differently.
Okay. Jeremy, what's your view on this? I mean, you're obviously a trustee on a couple of different companies, quite different companies, both of them. So what's your view on, you know, who you should be looking for as to fill that trustee role?
Well, I'd certainly echo what Sue was just saying about understanding the difference between a trustee and an ed. And I think it's also really important to understand that all the trustees have the same legal fiduciary responsibility in that role. And that is to ensure that the organisation is being run for the benefit of the beneficiaries. And therefore it's not to run the organisation, but it is to bring their skill and experience to ask the right questions and ensure that the leadership are thinking in the right way and managing the organisation in the way that it's been established. Some have founders' wishes or guiding principles, and it's to really understand the purpose of that trust board and not to try and run the organisation. So I think actually a range of skills, and that's why really understanding what you're trying to create within that trust board is so important. What their purpose is so important to understand that, because that will then help you recruit the right person, as Campbell said, for that point in time.
And Campbell, when you talk about the role of Jeremy's just talked about the role of the trust board. I mean, is it the case that different companies will have different roles for their trust boards then? Do you think there's a personality fit of the trust board to the organisation, or is one trust board in one organisation pretty similar to another one in another organisation?
No, I find them very different. In truth, I would talk about it on a scale of sort of passive to proactive. Is typically how I characterize the difference. And sometimes, you know, the business leadership or the business owners who are driving the transition in the first instance, you know, have an idea of where they want to sit on that spectrum from, I guess, what I call sort of trophy cabinet employee ownership. It sort of sits on the shelf. It's not mainstreamed in how the business thinks of itself. You take it off the shelf once a year, you dust it off, you distribute some dividend, and then you put it away again. That's very different and requires a different kind of trustee from, for instance, at the other end of the spectrum, a very proactive trustee group who might be taking on specific projects on behalf of the business, you know, reporting back on, you know, what they've learned from outside the business, driving change, you know, that understanding early on what kind of trust you want is going to be helpful when it comes to recruiting the kind of independent that you're looking for. Just a couple of other thoughts on it. You know, Sue made a really interesting point, and I have seen that multiple times as well, that because the exiting owner quite reasonably wants some reassurance, if you like, that this new thing that they're introducing, which is going to control the business to a point, isn't going to go rogue on them straight away. It's quite tempting to pick someone you already know, to pick a friend or somebody you trust and so on. And I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, but it does come with a perception risk, which is worth flagging. Because if what you really want is your employees to feel excited because you're making them owners, and actually there isn't a lot of change day to day early on, what can happen is that someone will look up and go, oh, this is interesting. So hang on, we're a small business, and you know, let's say there's 3 trustees and one of them's part of the management team already and the other one's a friend of the owner. Well, they've got that pretty well sewn up then, haven't they? And very quickly you know there'll be someone who's sort of disgruntled at the idea of it. And actually the credibility of that trustee group is super important, and the ability to communicate, the ability to operate transparently, the ability to coach, all of those things, that independent trustee needs to be able to role model that stuff really well. Almost no matter how proactive you want to be, you've got to be able to role model that stuff. So
there's something in the role of the independent trustee that actually is going to enforce the integrity of why the owner founder has moved to employee ownership in the very first place. So that's going to provide some of the legitimacy. I'm just looking at the chat now. You'll all be able to see this. We've got some really interesting questions coming through. Somebody's asked a question. Ada Young has asked, should you be looking to work with a trustee before you set up the trust? Or should you be looking to find that person before you actually even set up the trust?
Can I answer that, Deb? I see this a lot of times that you get brought in afterwards, and actually when you should really be brought in is beforehand. You've already got your financial valuation, you've got your lawyers doing all of that, but what they're not looking at is the practicality of the trust, how that gets implemented, to Campbell's comments about how you communicate that to employees, how you get them to start thinking as employee owners and thinking about participation. And a lot of people who are transitioning into EO founders or whoever selling the business, they feel like everything has to be done on day one. And actually, if you put an independent trustee in early, they can calm down all of those decisions. So you don't feel like everything has to be done on transition day. You can build a transition plan for the first year about engagement, participation, what your governance structure looks like and all of that sort of stuff. But the earlier you get an independent trustee in, the more the pressure gets taken away and the more you can sort of step back a bit and actually realise you don't have to do everything immediately.
And I'm reminded, Ollie's reminded me that, you know, we often talk a lot about good employee ownership and good governance, you know, so actually preparing effectively before you actually make that transition, this would arguably be part of that, and it builds on that transparency and openness which ultimately would engage employees. I got another question here from Val King. What additional duties and responsibilities does the chair of the trustees have? Now, we haven't talked about chairs of trustees, but let's just linger on that, because often this is the role of an independent, isn't it? So, and I mean, Campbell, that's what your role is at Broadway Malyon.
Yeah, and I think there's some practical, sort of slightly more obvious stuff around, you know, around what you would expect a chair, you know, of a governance group to do in terms of convening, in terms of you know, running meetings, in terms of managing meetings. That said, my experience, and maybe I'm betraying my own style here, but I do think that what you are not is quite often you will struggle to be a purely neutral chair. You are not simply there to facilitate the dialogue of others. There are going to be points at which you're going to need to be providing insight, providing leadership, frankly, and particularly early on, as I said, you know, you really need to have a view to, I guess what I would call ownership resilience. Like, how do you get this business that hasn't done this stuff before into the habits of good ownership? And you're going to need to, you know, be quite proactive on some of that stuff. I've probably missed some things there, but I'll give others a chance to jump in.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, I would agree with that. I think in addition, they're often the link between the organisation, the MD, the CEO, and the trust board. So they may well have more frequent meetings, and will sort of ensure that the processes are continued. And I think the other thing, of course, is to bear in mind is some organisations will have more than one independent. So they may bring in people because of a particular area, so in transitioning into employee ownership, or they may bring some historic sector understanding, not from the point of view of instructing the business, but actually being able to say and providing that insight to the rest of the trust board, particularly where it's a very complex sector, that actually, you know, what the board are doing is not unusual in this area. They're mitigating risks. These are the sort of things you would expect to see. So again, really understanding what you're trying to do, what you're wanting to create in that trust board, it will definitely influence the type of people you're looking for and the experience or otherwise that you're wanting them to bring. And I think one other point I'd just like to follow up on was, and I think it's a really helpful one, which is Campbell's point about the kind of range from very passive to active. Myself, I'm always slightly more concerned when you go down the active route. That for me should be instigated, where perhaps there's an agreed sense of risk, or there's an uncertainty about something going on. That I think is where the dynamic of the trust board will change slightly, where perhaps the business is going through hard times. I mean, we would have, or where actually that additional support is needed. We have all, I would imagine, as trustees, have been far busier during the COVID crisis than prior to that in many ways, and that plays back to Campbell's point about looking after the people and the human element as well.
Can I just come back in on that really quickly? Yeah, because I partly agree with that, but I don't wholly agree with that, Jeremy. So I get that, you know, if you're sort of starting, if you're sat at the slightly more passive end, then maybe the points of proactivity are based on responding to immediate risk or immediate challenge. But I've seen some incredibly thriving ownership cultures which are driven by proactive trusts who set themselves a remit to say, part of our role is to support the business overall to succeed. And there are things that we can do, you know, which isn't treading on the toes of the operating business, which isn't getting into sort of operational delivery. But, you know, quite often senior teams are just busy. They're just flat out doing that operational piece. And as you know, when you run in a business, you know, there's always a list of half a dozen things you wish you had the time to think about properly and get your head round and do a bit of research on to work out, how do I solve this properly? What are the answers? And actually having that, you know, thinking of your trust as a little bit of additional brain capacity to help challenge the business and make some recommendations on those kind of things can be really, really powerful. It can be engaging for people, engaging for trustees, and, you know, improve the performance of the business overall. So I do think as long as everybody's on the same page, that's what the trust is being asked to do, it can be really effective.
So we're probably only a couple of minutes left before we need to break into the breakout rooms, and obviously there's an opportunity there for those of you that have put your names forward to go and to discuss governance. There's 2 breakout rooms. Jeremy and Sue will be in one, and Campbell and I will be in the other. There's a couple of really interesting questions which I'm not sure we're going to get a chance to cover all of them now. I'm just going to ask one quick question, and this has come from Barry Matheson. Is it the norm for the owner to remain on the trust board? What additional challenges and opportunities given to the independent director, I think he means there. So that first question, is it normal for the owner to remain on the trust board? Yes or no, Sue?
It depends. Sorry.
It depends. There's always it depends.
I've seen both, and I've seen an owner who wanted to stay on the trust board, did stay on the trust board. 6 months in, realised actually they weren't adding any value and didn't want to be there and wanted to leave. So don't set it in stone, I think would be my answer. No.
I guess the question is, do owners assume they have to go on the trust board? And no, they don't, Campbell, you're shaking your head.
No, I just, you know, I'm going to go back to that credibility point I raised, right? You know, if people still perceive that after the change has happened, actually the person still pulling all of the puppet strings is the owner who's still involved in some way, then you are going to undermine your ability to bring ownership to life and to see any kind of change in attitude from people in the business. I've seen it with really benign owners who are super well respected, and that's great, and it doesn't cause friction, but it sort of lets everyone else off the hook. It sort of says, oh, okay, well, no, we don't need to worry about it because so-and-so is still there.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's just, you know, so if you want change, then yeah, don't put yourself on the trust.
Just
Okay.
as a final point, Deb, as well, if HMRC ever came in to check that you've actually transitioned, having your founder still involved in absolutely every role, board, trustee, everything, you'd struggle to say actually there's been a transition there.
Oh, that's a salutary warning from Sue there for many of you. I'm going to have to call it to a close now because we are out of time. So just quickly, you've reminded us that why would you do this? Why would you have an independent trustee? It's about external insight, expertise, neutrality and independence, bringing some challenge, possibly bringing some calmness to the transition and providing an interface into the board. Who is it? Who should that person be? We're reminded it's not a NED, so don't get confused that this is just a substitute for a NED. It's really important that there's a personality fit here, but that they are able to bring different questions, direction to the business. And should the trust board match the ambitions of the business in terms of that passive to proactive employee ownership? So if the business is a fairly benign employee owned business, then you don't want a trust that's really active in the employee ownership space because there might be a bit of clash, and equally the opposite. And that last point we finished on, which is about the perception risk. If the trust board doesn't have that independent view, then is that really telling the right message to the employees? I think that sort of summarises what the three of you are talking about, but there's plenty of space now for another conversation. I'm going to hand over to Ollie because he's going to explain how we're going to split people into these rooms, which hopefully isn't a surprise to you all because you all were asked which rooms you wanted to be in. Over to you, Ollie.